He thought removing her would protect the image of his restaurant, but in less than 5 minutes, he would realize he had just humiliated the wrong woman. The evening air in downtown Chicago carried that polished hush of wealth, where valet stands gleamed under warm lights and conversations floated softly behind glass walls, and inside La Belle Étoile, a place where dinner easily ran over $200 a plate. Everything was curated to perfection, from the crystal glasses catching golden reflections to the quiet confidence of guests dressed in tailored suits and silk dresses. And right through those doors walked Emily Carter, her steps calm, her presence almost invisible by design, wearing a simple cream blouse, dark jeans, and flat shoes that made no sound against the marble floor. She didn't pause to admire the chandeliers or the wine display worth more than most people's yearly rent. She simply approached the host's stand with a quiet grace that came from knowing exactly who she was, even if no one else in the room could see it. The hostess glanced up with a rehearsed smile that flickered just slightly when her eyes scanned Emily from head to toe, the kind of glance that measured worth in fabric and labels, not in character. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked, her tone polite but edged with doubt. Emily nodded gently, giving her name, and for a brief moment the hostess hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen as if expecting something not to match, but it did, and that was the first crack in the assumption. Still, instead of relief, there was confusion, subtle, but enough. "Right this way," the hostess said, though her voice had lost some of its warmth, leading Emily past tables where conversation slowed just enough for eyes to follow. Not openly, never openly, but in that refined, practiced way people look without looking. Emily felt it. Of course she did. She always did. But her expression didn't change, her eyes steady, her shoulders relaxed, as if she had long ago decided that other people's judgments didn't deserve her reaction. She was seated near the center of the room, not by the window, not hidden in the corner, a placement that made her visible. And visibility in a place like this came with scrutiny. A server approached, his posture professional, but there was a hesitation in his greeting. "Good evening," he said, though his eyes flicked briefly to her outfit before returning to neutral. He handed her the menu, describing specials with careful precision. Yet there was an undercurrent, a question unspoken. Emily thanked him softly, her voice calm, grounded, as she glanced over the menu without a hint of intimidation, because numbers, even large ones, had never defined her. Around her, the restaurant continued its quiet symphony, glasses clinking softly, low laughter, the muted hum of wealth comfortable in its own space. But at one table, a couple leaned slightly toward each other, whispering just loud enough for their curiosity to feel shared. At another, a man adjusted his cufflinks while casting a brief glance in her direction, as if trying to place her, trying to solve a puzzle that didn't fit the rules he understood. And then, from across the room, Victor Langford noticed her, the general manager, a man whose entire identity was built on maintaining standards, or at least his version of them. His tailored suit fit perfectly, his movements sharp and efficient, his eyes trained to spot anything that disrupted the illusion of exclusivity, and Emily, in her simplicity, stood out more than anyone dressed in designer labels. He watched her for a moment, calculating, his expression tightening just slightly as he began to walk toward her table, each step measured, each intention clear, because in his mind, he wasn't about to let one quiet woman threaten the image he had spent years protecting, and he had no idea that in just a few moments, the entire room would fall silent for a very different reason. Victor Langford stopped beside Emily's table with the kind of controlled smile that never quite reached his eyes, the kind reserved for situations he had already decided needed correction. And for a brief moment, he simply observed her, as if giving her one last chance to somehow fix the problem he believed she represented, the soft glow of the chandelier reflecting off the polished silverware between them, the quiet hum of the room continuing as though nothing had shifted, but something had, subtle, almost invisible, like the moment before a glass cracks. "Ma'am," he began, his voice smooth but firm, carrying just enough volume to reach the nearby tables without appearing intentional. "I am afraid there may have been a misunderstanding regarding your reservation." And the words hung in the air, carefully chosen, deliberately vague, designed to sound polite while implying error. Emily looked up at him, her expression calm, her eyes steady, not defensive, not surprised, just present, as if she had heard this tone before in different places, different voices, wearing different suits. "I do not believe there is a misunderstanding," she replied gently, her voice soft but clear, and for a fraction of a second, Victor's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, because confidence from someone he had already dismissed was not something he was prepared to entertain. He glanced briefly at the tablet in his hand. Though he already knew what it would show, the reservation was valid, the name was correct, but facts were not the issue here. Perception was, and perception, in his world, had to be protected at all costs. "Yes, well," he continued, adjusting his tone, layering it with a touch more authority, "this section of the restaurant is typically reserved for our regular clientele." The pause was intentional, the implication clear, and a nearby couple fell silent, their forks hovering just above their plates, listening without appearing to listen. Emily's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, as if the words had landed but failed to move her. "I am a guest here tonight," she said simply, and there was no challenge in her voice, only truth, which somehow made it more unsettling. Victor let out a quiet breath through his nose, a gesture so subtle it could have been mistaken for patience, but it was not patience. It was calculation. "Of course," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "However, we do maintain certain standards to ensure the experience of all our guests remains consistent." The word consistent lingered, polished, rehearsed, and heavy with meaning. And this time, a faint murmur rippled through the surrounding tables, not loud, not confrontational, just enough to create that electric tension that spreads when something feels off, but no one wants to be the first to acknowledge it. Emily's gaze did not waver. Her eyes met his with a quiet clarity that made the moment stretch longer than Victor intended. "And what standard am I not meeting?" she asked, and there it was, not anger, not defiance, just a question, simple and precise. And for the first time, Victor hesitated, not visibly, not to anyone who was not paying close attention, but the answer he had prepared did not sound as clean when spoken out loud. He shifted his weight slightly, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor. "It is not a matter of you personally," he replied, choosing his words carefully, though each one carried the weight of judgment. "It is simply about maintaining the atmosphere our guests expect." And now the room had changed. Conversations had slowed, glances had sharpened. The air itself felt tighter, like a string pulled just a little too far. Emily lowered her eyes for a brief second, not in defeat, but in thought. And when she looked back up, there was something different, something quieter, something steadier, as if she had made a decision long before this moment and was simply following it through. "I understand," she said softly, and Victor nodded. Once, already turning slightly as if the matter had been resolved, as if she would stand, apologize, and leave without resistance. Because that was how these moments usually ended. That was how the balance remained intact. But Emily did not move. Instead, she reached calmly into her bag, her fingers moving with unhurried precision, and the room, already on edge, seemed to lean in just a fraction more. Because something about her stillness suggested that this moment was not ending the way Victor expected, not this time. Emily's fingers closed around her phone with a quiet certainty that did not match the tension building around her, and for a brief second, Victor watched her with a flicker of impatience. Assuming she was about to call for a ride, to quietly remove herself and restore the balance he believed he controlled. But there was something in the way she held the device, steady, unhurried, that made the moment stretch longer than expected, the soft glow of the screen reflecting faintly in her eyes as she unlocked it. Not rushed, not flustered, just deliberate. "If there is nothing else," Victor began, his voice tightening slightly as he prepared to conclude the interaction, to end it on his terms. But Emily lifted her gaze just enough to meet his again, not interrupting, not challenging, simply existing in a way that refused to be dismissed, and without raising her voice, without drawing attention to herself, she spoke a single sentence into the quiet space between them. "I think you should come inside," her tone calm, almost gentle, as if she were speaking to someone who already understood more than anyone else in the room did. And then she lowered the phone, ending the call. With a soft tap, the sound nearly lost beneath the faint clink of glassware nearby. Victor's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough, a subtle narrowing of his eyes as he tried to place the meaning behind her words, because this was not the reaction he had anticipated, not the apology, not the retreat, not even the confrontation he had prepared himself to manage. This was something else, something quieter, something that did not fit into the patterns he relied on, and around them. The room seemed to sense it too. Conversation slowed further, the air tightening into that delicate silence that forms when people realize they are witnessing something they do not fully understand. A server paused mid-step. A couple near the window leaned slightly closer together, their voices dropping to whispers that carried just enough curiosity to keep the moment alive. Victor straightened his posture, regaining the composure that had defined his entire career, because whatever this was, he believed he could still control it. "Ma'am, if you are waiting for someone, I would be happy to arrange seating elsewhere," he offered, though the words were less an offer and more a final attempt to redirect the outcome. Emily shook her head slightly, a small movement, but firm, her expression unchanged, her eyes calm in a way that felt almost out of place in the rising tension. "No, thank you," she replied softly. And that was all. No explanation, no defense, just a quiet refusal to move. And for the first time, Victor felt something he had not expected to feel tonight. Uncertainty. It was faint, buried beneath years of practiced authority, but it was there, like a hairline crack beneath polished marble. And then it came, subtle at first, a low, distant hum that most would have ignored, blending into the background noise of the city outside. But in a room this controlled, this curated, even the smallest disruption could not go unnoticed. The sound grew slightly louder, not intrusive, but distinct, the unmistakable purr of an engine built for precision rather than noise. And it carried through the glass facade of the restaurant like a signal, drawing attention without demanding it. A few heads turned instinctively toward the entrance, their movements slow, almost cautious, as if they did not want to break the fragile stillness that had settled over the room. Victor's gaze flickered briefly toward the front doors, then back to Emily, his expression tightening once more as he tried to dismiss the coincidence. But the timing lingered, too precise, too aligned with the quiet certainty in her voice just moments earlier. Outside, headlights cut across the polished floor in long, clean lines, reflections shifting like moving light across the walls, and the valet, who had been standing with the relaxed posture of someone accustomed to routine, suddenly straightened, his attention snapping into focus as the vehicle rolled to a smooth, controlled stop, the kind of stop that spoke of confidence rather than urgency. And inside, without anyone announcing it, without a single word being spoken, the energy of the room changed completely, as if something unseen had just entered the equation, and Emily remained exactly where she was, her hands resting lightly on the table, her posture composed, her eyes steady, as though she had already seen how this moment would unfold. While Victor stood there, caught between maintaining control and acknowledging the shift he could no longer ignore, and in that quiet, suspended second, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The headlights held steady against the glass like a quiet announcement that something had shifted beyond anyone's control, and outside, the sleek silhouette of a Porsche came to a precise stop beneath the soft glow of the restaurant's entrance lights, its engine humming low, confident, the kind of sound that did not demand attention yet commanded it effortlessly. And the valet moved instantly now, his posture no longer relaxed but alert, almost reverent, as he stepped forward with a level of urgency that had not been present all evening. The door opened smoothly, and for a brief second, no one inside could see clearly who was stepping out. Only the outline, tall, composed, framed by the city lights behind him. But the effect was immediate. Conversations that had been hanging by a thread now fell completely silent. Glasses paused midair, forks hovered inches above plates, and every eye, no matter how discreetly, turned toward the entrance, drawn by something they could not yet explain. Victor felt it before he fully understood it, that subtle shift in atmosphere, the kind that could not be corrected with a polished sentence or a controlled smile. His attention flickered again toward the doors, this time lingering just a moment too long. And when he turned back to Emily, something in her stillness unsettled him further, because she had not moved, not even slightly, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as though she had already accounted for what was happening. Outside, as though this moment belonged to her long before it unfolded, the door opened, and the man stepped inside, the soft click echoing louder than it should have in the charged silence. His suit tailored with effortless precision, dark, understated, the kind of elegance that did not need to announce itself, his presence alone enough to alter the rhythm of the room. He paused just inside, his eyes scanning once, not hurried, not searching, but assessing, and then they found her, across the room, seated quietly at a table that suddenly felt like the center of everything. And in that instant, something unspoken passed between them, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just a quiet recognition that required no explanation. Victor followed the direction of the man's gaze, and as his eyes landed back on Emily, the pieces began to align in a way he had not anticipated, the faintest crease forming between his brows. His confidence no longer as solid as it had been moments ago, the man began to walk forward, each step measured, unhurried, the polished floor reflecting his movement in clean lines that seemed to draw the entire room's attention along with him. Staff members who had been moving with practiced efficiency now found themselves stepping slightly aside, creating space without being asked, because something about his presence made it clear that space would be given whether requested or not. A server near the aisle straightened instinctively, his earlier hesitation replaced by something closer to recognition, though he could not quite place why. Victor adjusted his stance, his shoulders tightening just slightly as he prepared to regain control of the situation, because whatever this was, he believed he could still manage it. He had built his reputation on managing moments like this, on maintaining the illusion that nothing ever slipped beyond his reach. But as the man approached, that illusion felt thinner, more fragile, like glass under pressure. Emily remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the table, her gaze steady as she watched him draw closer, and there was no surprise in her expression, no urgency, only a quiet certainty that made everything around her feel louder by contrast. The man stopped beside her table, close enough now that the details became undeniable, the precision of his suit, the calm authority in his posture, the quiet confidence that did not need validation, and without raising his voice, without disrupting the silence that had taken hold of the room, he spoke, his tone even, controlled, yet carrying a weight that reached every corner of the restaurant. "Is there a problem here?" And it was not a question asked in confusion, but one asked with complete awareness, the kind that demanded an answer whether anyone was ready to give it or not. Victor felt the shift land fully then, not just in the room, but within himself, because in that moment, he understood that whatever he had assumed about Emily Carter was about to be proven very, very wrong, and the silence that followed was no longer comfortable. It was absolute. Victor Langford felt every eye in the room shift toward him as the question settled into the silence. And for the first time that evening, the confidence he carried so effortlessly began to fracture under the weight of something he could not immediately control. He straightened his posture, smoothing the front of his suit, as if restoring order to himself would restore order to the moment. But the room was no longer his to command. Not entirely. Not anymore. "There is no problem," he replied. Quickly, his voice measured, though a slight tightness crept into it that had not been there before. Just a minor misunderstanding regarding seating arrangements. And he forced a polite smile, directing it toward the man standing beside Emily, hoping to contain the situation within language that sounded reasonable, contained, professional. But the man did not return the smile. His expression remained composed, unreadable, his gaze steady, fixed not on Victor's words, but on the space between intention and truth. "A misunderstanding," he repeated calmly, the words neither agreeing nor challenging, simply placing them back into the air where they felt heavier the second time. Emily remained seated, her presence quiet yet undeniable, her eyes moving briefly to meet his. And in that glance, there was no distress, no urgency, only a quiet reassurance that seemed to ground the moment in a way nothing else could. The man gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, before shifting his attention fully back to Victor. "Then I would like to understand it," he said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any raised voice could have, because it left no room for deflection, No easy exit. Victor felt the room lean in further, the kind of attention that stripped away performance and demanded substance. He cleared his throat lightly, choosing his next words with care. We simply aim to maintain a certain atmosphere for our guests, he began, repeating the same polished explanation that had served him countless times before. But this time, the words sounded thinner, less certain, as if even he could hear the weakness in them. The man's gaze did not shift, did not soften. "And she disrupts that atmosphere?" he asked. Not accusing, not emotional, just precise, and the question hung there, exposing the underlying assumption without needing to name it. Victor hesitated, just a fraction, but enough for the silence to deepen, for the people watching to feel the shift more clearly. "It is not about disruption," Victor corrected, though his tone lacked the authority it had carried earlier. "It is about consistency." And even as he said it, the word felt rehearsed, hollow against the reality unfolding around him. The man glanced briefly around the room, taking in the details, the polished setting, the carefully curated elegance. And then his eyes returned to Emily, still seated, still composed, still the calm center of a moment that had unraveled everything Victor thought he controlled. "Consistency," he echoed softly. And then, after a pause that seemed to stretch time itself, he spoke again, his voice even, controlled, yet carrying a quiet finality. "She is my wife." And the effect was immediate, not loud, not explosive, but absolute, like a line drawn across the room that no one could ignore. Victor's expression froze, not dramatically, but enough, the realization landing in layers, first confusion, then recognition, then something closer to disbelief, because the pieces that had not fit before suddenly aligned with uncomfortable clarity, the calm confidence, the refusal to react, the quiet certainty in her voice. It all made sense now, and around them, the room reacted in its own silent way. Glances shifted, whispers stilled, even the air seemed to change, as if acknowledging that something fundamental had just been revealed. Emily did not move, did not speak, her posture unchanged, her dignity intact, as though none of this altered who she was, only how others were forced to see her. Victor opened his mouth slightly, as if to respond, to correct, to recover, but no words came, because there was nothing he could say that would undo what had already been exposed. And in that moment, standing under the weight of his own assumptions, he understood that the situation was no longer his to manage, it was his to answer for. And the silence that followed was not empty, it was undeniable. The words settled into the room like a weight no one could ignore, and Victor Langford felt the shift move through him in a slow, undeniable wave. His posture still upright, his expression still composed, but something beneath it had cracked, something that could not be repaired with a polished sentence or a carefully measured tone. His eyes flickered once more to Emily, and this time, he was not seeing her as a disruption, not as an anomaly to be corrected, but as someone he had fundamentally misjudged. And that realization did not come with noise. It came with silence, the kind that strips away every assumption and leaves only truth behind. Daniel Carter did not move closer, did not raise his voice. He simply stood beside the table, his presence alone enough to command the space without effort. "I would like you to explain," he said calmly, his voice steady, controlled, yet carrying a quiet authority that made every word land with precision. "What exactly about my wife does not meet your standards?" And there was no anger in the question, no aggression, only clarity, and that made it impossible to deflect, impossible to soften. Victor opened his mouth, his mind searching for the same phrases that had always protected him, the language of policy, of experience, of expectation, but none of it fit anymore. None of it sounded right in the presence of what had just been revealed. "Sir, I believe there has been a misunderstanding," he repeated, though the words now felt smaller, weaker, stripped of the confidence they once carried. Daniel's gaze did not shift. "You have already said that," he replied evenly. "And yet my wife was asked to leave." The room held its breath again, the kind of silence that grows heavier with each passing second. Victor felt the attention pressing in from every direction, the eyes of guests who had once trusted his judgment now watching to see how he would respond. And for the first time, He understood that this moment was no longer about maintaining an atmosphere. It was about accountability, and accountability had a way of revealing things he could not control. Emily remained seated, her hands resting gently on the table, her expression unchanged, her dignity untouched by the tension unfolding around her, as if she had already moved beyond the moment that still held everyone else in place. Daniel glanced down at her briefly, a quiet check, a silent question, and she met his gaze with the same calm assurance, a subtle nod that required no words. And then he looked back at Victor. "We came here for dinner," he said simply, "not to be evaluated." And the statement cut through the room with more force than any raised voice could have, because it was undeniable, because it spoke to something deeper than policy or perception. Victor swallowed lightly, the movement small but noticeable in the stillness, his carefully constructed authority now feeling less like control and more like exposure. "I assure you, that was not the intention," he said, though even he could hear the distance between his words and his actions. Daniel tilted his head slightly, considering, not rushed, not emotional, just precise. "Intent does not change what happened," he replied, and the truth in that statement settled into the room with a quiet finality. A server nearby shifted his weight. Another guest lowered their glass slowly, as if afraid to disrupt the fragile balance of the moment. Victor's hands remained at his sides, still, controlled, but no longer confident, because there was nothing left to hide behind, no explanation that could undo what had already been seen. And for a brief second, he understood something he had never allowed himself to consider before, that the standards he believed he was protecting had never been about quality or experience, but about judgment, about assumption, about deciding who belonged and who did not without ever asking the question that mattered. Daniel's voice broke the silence once more, softer now, but no less firm. "The question is not whether you intended it," he said. "The question is what you are going to do about it." And in that moment, standing in the center of the room he once controlled so completely, Victor Langford realized that the answer would define more than just this evening. It would define everything that came after, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was expectant. Victor Langford stood there with the weight of expectation pressing down on him from every corner of the room, and for the first time in years, he did not have an immediate answer, not a polished line, not a practiced solution, only the quiet realization that the moment demanded something real, something he had spent his career avoiding. His eyes shifted once more to Emily Carter, and this time there was no calculation in his gaze, no attempt to categorize or dismiss, only the recognition of a mistake that had already unfolded too far to be undone. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable now, but sharp, focused, as if the entire room was waiting for a single decision to define everything that had just happened. Victor inhaled slowly, steadying himself, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, still controlled, still measured, but stripped of the thin layer of superiority that had once shaped every word. "Mrs. Carter," he began, and even the use of her name carried a shift, an acknowledgement that had not been present before. "I owe you an apology." And the words landed with a quiet weight, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but undeniable. A ripple moved through the room, subtle but present, as if the guests themselves had not expected to hear it, because apologies in places like this were often disguised, softened, redirected, but this one was clear, direct, and it forced everyone listening to confront the reality of what had occurred. Emily looked up at him, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, not accepting, not rejecting, simply listening, and that alone made the moment feel more honest. Victor continued, choosing each word carefully, not to protect himself, but to say what had been avoided. "You were treated in a way that does not reflect the values we claim to uphold," he said, and there was a slight pause, just enough to acknowledge that those values had been broken, not by accident, but by assumption. Daniel remained still beside her, his presence unwavering, his gaze fixed on Victor with the same quiet intensity, not interrupting, not softening the moment, allowing it to unfold fully, because anything less would have been incomplete. "There is no excuse for that," Victor added, and for a brief second, his voice faltered, not from weakness, but from the unfamiliar weight of speaking without a shield, the room absorbed it, every word settling into the polished space like something that could not be erased. Emily's hands remained lightly placed on the table, her posture calm, her breathing steady, and after a moment, she spoke, her voice soft but clear, carrying through the silence without effort. "It is not about the apology," she said, and the simplicity of her statement shifted the focus entirely, because it moved beyond the moment, beyond the words, into something deeper. Victor's brow tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in understanding, as if he already knew what she meant before she finished. "It is about what happens after," she continued, her tone even, not accusatory, not emotional, just grounded in truth, and the room leaned in again. Not out of curiosity now, but out of something closer to reflection, because her words were not directed only at him. They reached further, touching everyone who had watched without speaking, everyone who had assumed without questioning. Victor nodded slowly, the movement small but deliberate. "You are right," he said, and this time, there was no hesitation, no attempt to reframe, only acceptance. He turned slightly, his gaze moving across the staff who had paused, who had witnessed everything unfold, and then back to Emily and Daniel. "We will correct this," he said, and the statement was not loud, not forceful, but it carried a different kind of authority now, one rooted not in control, but in responsibility. Daniel watched him for a moment longer, as if measuring the difference between what had been said before and what was being said now, and then he gave a slight nod, not approval, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement, because this was not about a single moment, it was about what would follow. The room remained quiet, but the silence had changed. It was no longer tense, no longer uncertain, it was reflective, as if everyone present understood that something had shifted beyond the boundaries of a single dinner, and Victor Langford, standing in the center of it all, realized that for the first time, the standards he had been protecting were no longer defined by appearances, but by the courage to face what had been wrong and the willingness to change it. The room did not return to normal, not immediately, because moments like this do not simply fade. They settle, they linger in the air like something that reshapes the space itself, and Victor Langford understood that now as he straightened his posture once more, not out of habit, but out of intention, his movements slower, more deliberate, as if each action needed to reflect the shift that had taken place. He turned slightly toward the staff, his voice carrying just enough to reach them without breaking the quiet tone of the room. "I want this table reset," he said, but the words were different now, not commands driven by image, but instructions rooted in correction. "And I want Mrs. Carter to be served exactly as any guest here would be, with full attention and respect." There was no hesitation in his voice, no ambiguity, and that alone caused a subtle ripple among the servers, who moved quickly, but with a new awareness, as if they too had recognized the weight of what had happened. A fresh set of silverware was placed, glasses adjusted, the smallest details corrected with care that should have been present from the beginning. And yet it was not the service itself that changed the room. It was the intention behind it, the acknowledgement that something had been wrong and was now being addressed without disguise. Emily remained seated, watching quietly, her expression unchanged, not impressed, not softened, simply observant, as if she were measuring not the gestures, but the meaning behind them. Daniel pulled out the chair across from her and sat down with the same composed presence he had carried since entering, his movements calm, precise, as though none of this required urgency, because control did not come from speed, it came from certainty. Victor remained standing for a moment longer, the instinct to retreat replaced by the understanding that leaving too quickly would diminish the sincerity of what had just been said. "Your meal this evening will be taken care of," he added, his tone steady. "But more importantly, we will be reviewing how this happened, so it does not happen again." And there was a quiet finality in that statement, not defensive, not performative, but grounded in accountability. Daniel's gaze lifted slightly, meeting Victor's once more, and for a brief second, there was a silent exchange, not of power, but of understanding. A recognition that what mattered now was not the correction of the moment, but the consistency of what came after. He gave a small nod, subtle, controlled, and Victor returned it before stepping back, not rushing, not escaping, but allowing the space to return to its guests, though it would never feel quite the same again around them. The room slowly began to move again, conversations restarting in softer tones, glances still lingering, but no longer filled with curiosity, now touched with reflection. A couple near the window resumed their dinner, though their voices remained quieter, more thoughtful. A server approached Emily's table with a composed smile, this time genuine, not measured. "May I take your order, Mrs. Carter?" he asked, and the difference was unmistakable, not in the words, but in the respect behind them. Emily looked at him for a moment, her eyes steady, and then she nodded gently, her voice calm as she began to speak, as if the moment that had unfolded had not shaken her, only revealed what had always been there, the quiet strength, the unshakable dignity that did not need validation to exist. Daniel listened as she spoke, his posture relaxed now, though his presence remained firm, a quiet anchor beside her, and as the server noted the order with careful attention, the room continued its slow return to motion. But something had changed beneath the surface, something that could not be unseen. Victor Langford stood near the edge of the dining area, watching for just a moment longer, not to control, not to correct, but to understand, and in that understanding, there was something new, something unfamiliar, but necessary. Because the standards he once believed defined the space had been rewritten in a single evening, not by wealth, not by status, but by a quiet refusal to be diminished. And as the soft clink of glassware resumed, and the low hum of conversation returned, the lesson remained, unspoken, but undeniable, carried in the silence that still lingered beneath it all. The evening continued, but it did not return to what it had been before, because something invisible had shifted beneath the surface of every conversation, every glance, every quiet exchange between guests who had witnessed more than just a misunderstanding. Emily Carter sat across from Daniel, with the same calm presence she had carried from the moment she walked in, her posture relaxed, her voice soft as she spoke about ordinary things, as if the weight of what had happened did not need to be carried forward, because she had never allowed it to define her in the first place. And Daniel listened with a quiet attentiveness, his expression composed, though there was a subtle warmth in his gaze now, not just for her, but for the way she had remained steady when others might have reacted, might have tried to prove something, might have raised their voice to be heard, but she had not. She had simply been, and that had changed everything. Around them, the restaurant moved with a different rhythm, not slower, not quieter, but more aware, as if every person present had been reminded of something they had forgotten, something that could not be written into a menu or reflected in polished glass. A couple at a nearby table exchanged a glance that carried more thought than before. A man in a tailored suit adjusted his posture slightly, his earlier confidence now tempered by reflection. Even the servers moved with a heightened sense of intention, their gestures more deliberate, their attention more present,